for the DIA Speech and Debate Judges Fellowship. Our trainer is very ready. So I'm going to take you through a little bit of his achievements, his personal speaker achievements in terms of debates, and definitely along the way during the course of the presentation, he'll take you through more of his achievements in judging, particularly, and go ahead to share that kind of expertise and full energy, right? So the guy has a kind of a bit of Nigerian disposition, but yeah, guys, don't worry, he's our very own, and we celebrate him. So in terms of debating as an individual, he was champion at the pre-ANYDC, that's in 2024, and the KDC pre-PADC, as well as the South Africa Grand Match. And he was finalist at the African Bowl and ANDL, the 1962, as well as ADUCE and RPDA internals, right? And these are like speaker achievements for top 5 speaker awards, right? So at the very African 4 and EAUDC, as well as UED 4 and RPDA internals 4.0, right? So that's but only a brief of achievements that Rahim has as a speaker, right? So these are some of the tournaments that most of you all have dreamt of or will be participating or judging in the future, right? So this is just to make you guys have the thrill of the trainer that you're going to have. But of course, he'll tell you more about himself and the expertise and the experience that he's had along the way. So guys, feel free to interact as just about going to say your eyes. So feel free to ask questions whenever you want him to clarify, or if he's a bit speedy, you can always, I don't know, he will clarify on how he'll be taking questions, but you can always type in the chat. I guess he'll follow through and he'll take us through. Right. So that said, Mr. Kibirango, the floor is yours. Please, ready when you are. Thank you.
All right. Thanks very much, Barack, for that. I also like to thank DIA for organizing this session. And yeah, I hope that this is a really good endeavor. You're gonna just give me like 1 minute to some water to break my fast. Otherwise, I'm gonna use this moment to just clarify on what exactly I'm going to be talking about. The session is about identifying and weighing issues in debates. Largely, we are going to talk about clashes, and we are also going to talk about other things that become very contentious within debates. That includes logical consistency, evidence that is usually presented within debate, and also I'll talk about the nature of cases, and we'll see how definitely that helps us understand and also get to identify clashes in debates. Okay, so as earlier said, feel free at any point of this engagement to just open up your mic or drop a question in the chat, something that could definitely help me provide much more than I've just prepared right now, and we'll see how that goes. So I'm gonna first explain like why identifying weighing issues, especially to judges, is important. For a person who has spoken like more than about 50 plus tournaments, there's at times when it becomes like important to speakers to sort of like feel like judges honestly recognize what they have offered. And usually this is what determines how you're going to be sort of like rated as a judge, because speakers do give feedback on you, but it also reflects your attention in around your active listening and your overall r- like your overall, sorry about that, it also affects like your overall engagement in the debate. Even as a judge, you must be able to identify the core issues of the debate as delivered by a team, or at the very least be able to offer reasons as to why they are not the core issues of the debate. all this comes from fast identifying, because in the later stage that comes out of that is weighing. I know a lot of good judges out there that might not necessarily have the best structured oral adjudication, but in the very least, they are very able to explain like how they weighed those issues, but also be able to sort of like provide a framework in which their weighing ought to be sort of like understood and is evaluated. So I think this session is largely going to be sharing just that, but just at the back of your mind, know these are things that are important in terms of how you yourself gets to make the most proximate call, but how other people perceive your call in the justification behind it. So I'm going to start on the first part on how to determine key clashes in a debate. This thing is very important because usually we have two types of clashes. The first type is what we call soft clashes. The second type is what we call hard clashes. So what are soft clashes and what are hard clashes? Soft clashes are simply clashes that don't have that much level of contention in the debate. So they usually come out of things like arguments and where they're premised off, the kind of analysis that supports it, but also the impact that they largely have in the debate. So these clashes are usually just created by speakers making different arguments on the matter that they probably want to offer in of itself. Why I call these soft clashes, or why they are known as soft clashes, is that usually it's simple enough to reconcile which argument is much more plausible, which argument is much more analyzed to a greater extent. So it is really, really easy for judges to kind of explain why this argument ought to be prioritized over the other by an average intelligent voter, maybe because of the effort that is put within that argument, maybe because of how much engagement that has had in the debate. It's very easy to see the kind of contention that these arguments usually present, and as such, they are known as soft clashes. Three things then that you need to know about soft clashes. One, the point of evaluation is first how engaging that argument is. Crazy for three criterion. So an argument engages one, how it engages the other team's case. So usually speakers are brilliant enough to tell you what their argument on choice reflects in terms of another argument may be made for the preservation of life. So they can give you like a logical connection between their argument A and another argument B coming from the other side. However, you also can identify that logical connection, and this most of the times does not mean that you have to fill the logical gap. It's just that in instances where none of the teams tries to create that logical connection between the two arguments, of course, you have to vote which team wins over the other based on the nature of arguments that they present, but also the nature of engagement that is in the debate. Exclusive of that, you ought to fill in the connection and offer the matrix that you neutrally use to show why one argument like probably engages better than the other or gets to win over the other. So that's like the first criterion of engagement. The second criterion of engagement is what I also like to call the implication of an argument onto the conversation that we are having, the debate generally. And this is usually because speakers are able to sort of like come to a consensus about what the motion literally translates and how it ought to be seen as in the likes. So most of the times their arguments have like a logical conclusion to what the conversation is. So if you're having a motion, in, let's say the motion is about Africa having to significantly increase its investments in green energy, and the argument is as still as green energy is going to earn African countries a lot of money because the world market is largely demanding for it, but also because they control the nature of like the competitiveness of the oil and all the other minerals that would be used as alternatives. So it gives them the most proximate control on that market in terms of competitiveness, but also in terms of having that market maximized for them. So this argument is brought out just fine, just averagely well, but maybe it has an implication on that kind of conversation it has. And maybe a speaker is going to explain to you like why, even with this argument, we must consider the investment to be much more significant than what it currently is. So this in of itself provides like a point of weighing for you to understand whether the argument is just a stale argument or the argument in of itself has a logical conclusion that you must hold like to some degree a greater contribution or engagement to the debate as a general thing. The third and last thing is how speakers most likely enjoy trying to convince judges as an average intelligent voter with their arguments, exclusive of the two engagements I've talked about earlier. That is the engagement of other arguments or the engagement of the motion as well. So maybe they're just giving you some kind of assessment on why the average intelligent person would want to convey this. They can use things like intuitions, they can use principles or moral frameworks that we probably think of as things that are important to us, irrespective of all the other things that must be held prior in terms of like logic and analysis and whatnot. So this argument in of itself has like some kind of fourth world engagement in the debate scenario itself. So it tends to convince the average person on why that argument should be held as much more important or prior to all the other arguments in the debate. Again, so soft clashes are literally based off simple argumentation and what that argumentation is able to offer in the debate. And largely, that's how to sort of identify the engagement that comes out of those arguments, and also largely how it influences the weighing kind of evaluation you're going to offer as compared to all the other arguments in the debate. So that's just it with soft clashes. Do we have any questions on soft clashes before I proceed to the hard clashes? I guess not. So okay, so let's just talk about hard clashes. Under hard clashes, we have an enormous bit of category of things that usually leads to very, very strong contentions in the debate round. And these are elements of debates that we largely find ourselves as very hard to make, but also elements in debates that usually bring like a certain hold to the general nature of arguing in a debate. So two things to know about like these elements as a broader category of why they fall within hard clashes is that their reconciliation comes first for the speakers to continue making arguments a certain way. But secondly, they directly about hard clashes. I think just by highlighting what these perspective of what arguments could most likely fall in here. So one of these are the burdens that include explicit implicit burdens roam around debate. That is to say, you have speakers that are most likely going to tell you this is a burden we want to prove on our side. This is the burden that they have to engage and the likes. But also, you know about the burdens that are based off specific motion types and the likes. And usually, when speakers are trying to engage with burdens in the most holistic and clear way to do so, they use elements of contextualization, they use elements of characterization, and they use elements of framing. Now, the reason why you want to understand these things very closely as a judge is that speakers most of the times do not have the best of time to continuously keep flagging to you that, Mr. Chair, what I'm giving you right now is a characterization, and this is the framing that most likely comes understand that these things largely influence how contentious the cases are going to be looking like. Why do we believe this to be true? So, two things here. The first is that with different context presented by Team A, with different characterization and framing presented by Team A, the cases might most likely not logically link. And you only need to sort of like weigh what is the most likely probable kind of context to have the debate in, or how you can come to a consensus for the speakers, even when they don't want to reconcile each other's context, even when they don't want to reconcile each other's characterizations and framing. This now allows you, after like sort of reconciling these two kinds of perspectives, to go ahead and now evaluate their content much more holistically, especially the content that is to do with their cases, but also that is to do with their arguments. So that's like why this is majorly important, especially when it comes to judging. So again, we ought to know like what sexualization, characterization, and framing are in order for us to know how to create a framework to evaluate like these specific things. The first is to understand what context majorly is. In the debate community, there is not largely a consensus on many things and how we get to define them. So I'll largely go off like my own intuition or the past experiences I've had in other training sessions, but also in my own debate journey to sort of like get to describe these things. So it is, feel free to ask like, Rahim, is this really what contextualization is? Is this what framing really is? And those particular things. So it's just to help us to be on the same track. Otherwise, so contextualization to Rahim includes a couple of things. When people most of the times talk about context, one, they talk about like the nature of world in which the debate is most likely going to be had. So they try to create like some kind of boundary in which you're going to have this debate existing. But beyond that, things that also support largely to try and create a specific context and the direct implications of context and how it ought to be evaluated in debate are trends that influence the debate in of itself. They support and opposition groups or something, the narratives and around it, the ideals, the manifestation, and the purpose of X essentially if you're having a debate on it. I'm gonna just try to illustrate this and show like why context is majorly something very important, especially if laid in the debate. But I'm also going to explain like why it usually has a shift of burdens and what teams legitimately ought to prove to you as a judge and what they ought not to engage or engage based off the context that they have provided to you. So if you're having a debate and this debate says it's just a really open debate, and the debate says this house supports the invasion of China. So a debater would say that we think on our side the most likely countries to take on this invasion are countries in that G7. So countries like the US, countries that have sufficient military power. Just by giving you like the nature of context in which like the conversation is basically happening in, so these are countries that are really powerful, that have military. It just makes the debate charitable enough so that they engage the much more contentious bits of the debate. It just gives room for safe argumentation and it gives room for like relevant argumentation on their side so that they don't have to go like the nitty gritties of arguing around, oh, there's no country that could definitely probably attack China and the like. And as such, like it undermines the existence of the debate in itself. So it just makes it very bad to stop at the primary level of the debate. That's why like speakers usually offer context to you. But as you're evaluating this, I want you to consider like two things important. Context in of itself, characterization and framing are usually like claims in of themselves. Like so for example, for characterization, it's simply a descriptive claim. So what I want to prove here is that These things are also up for debate too. What I mean by this is that most of the time speakers have to prove like why this is most likely true or why it's justified to perceive the debate that specific context or to allow this characterization in as true in that specific debate. So as you evaluate it, ask yourself if there is some kind of like context, like contest towards the context and characterization provided in the debate, which team most likely proves to you why their context is right or why their context is justified, and what probably uh goes ahead to within status quo to imply that their context is much more likely like plausible within that specific regard. So it is also one key criterion that you could use to evaluate like what team comes over the other while they are trying to contextualize the debate. And it is very, very okay for a judge to try and consider or buy into the reason given by one team or other as to why their context is true. But lastly, because they are also now natural elements of debate, they have some kind of implied benefit or value, or like basically an engagement that ought to be created out of them. If you have ever been in a round where like speakers just say, this debate is going to happen in countries like Uganda, and countries like Uganda are mostly and they don't have very stable government systems. They are probably characterized by things like corruption. And they go on to give like their separate arguments that don't directly link to the nature of text they have said in the debate, but also how they have closely characterized the governments in Uganda. You ought to evaluate their context as and characterization as not strong because they don't directly tell you what that implies for the debate. So the second criterion of assessment is what does the context as well as the characterization imply for the debate. I'm gonna just complete what I claimed earlier. So maybe the speaker directly is trying to prove to you, and they will say, because of the nature of these governments as we've described them, it means that we probably do not want to have the funding, maybe things like women's kind of businesses and interests through the government itself. We would rather do it through like civil society organizations. This is a very logical conclusion as to why like they are trying to show you that the policy, even if existing, should go through a different kind of like mechanism or should take on different hands to have this policy much more on their side. It's not unfair at all, especially if they try to explain why this is very justified on their side, and that is through explaining like what the alter implication of going through government would most likely be. So it's not an argument per se, but it's to some extent trying to strengthen the level of contextualization they offer debate, but also the level of characterization that is being offered and why we should relatively consider it's like much more important. Again, when teams try to do this most time as you're trying to favor one context over the other, one characterization over the other that are directly competing in the debate, you ought to ask yourself like which one had a much strategical implication in the debate. And I think that two criteria I've given you are what allow you have that holistic engagement and evaluation. So you will definitely now know why to prefer one context, one consideration over the other, especially if they are mutually exclusive in existence of the debate. So yeah, that's just it with context and characterization. I want to talk about framing because framing carries and encompasses a lot of things. But before I do that, I also want to take a question from any of us that probably wants to know much more about like contextualization and characterization, especially from the perspective a judge and how you ought to see perceive these things. Any questions? Okay, just give me a second to go to chat as well. Okay, so no questions. Real quick, I'm gonna just to framing, and I'm gonna explain like two types of framing because framing is largely now different. And one is just framing that comes out of the world building, which is much similar to like characterization and context that I've given. But the way to understand this is that just as you have an argument with an impact, most of the times characterization lead to a specific framing. So this type of framing is like the framing that is the implication of a characterization in a debate. So just like the example that I gave earlier, the characterization of the descriptive claim here is um, third world countries usually have poor government systems, and the framing in the debate now becomes that you cannot hand money to governments that are bureaucratic or based of any other reasons that that team is going to give as logically true as to why we shouldn't take that route. So the framing here is showing the bounds in which we should have this discussion and actively not allow opposition to go away by just enforcing these maybe non so contentious arguments to the spirit of the motion as to what they would literally want to have in the debate. So, in framing, in the third, sorry, second type of framing is what is more largely exclusive of the elements of characterization. That's the larger kind of elements in the debate that burdens, stakeholders, moral frameworks, and even argument specific framing. So we are going to go burden framing first because it's usually the most like chaotic and contentious kind of framing that you want to identify, you want to evaluate, and after that, after reconciling all that, you can then go to assessing the cases and ask yourself, like, which team did a better job at proving their burden, and was it unfair for a team to have like this specific burden from one team imposed on it over the other? So, right before we go into burdens, I just want to quickly remind you that we had already described that there are two kinds of burdens. There are burdens that largely come out of like a specific motion type, and often at times you will hear like teams doing these burdens around. So they will say to government team, "This is a regret motion. You guys need to offer to us a counterfactual," and that's how we'll have the debate. So, amazingly, there is no such thing as an automatic form. So, this is why, even with burdens that are less dynamic and are very static coming out of the motion framing, you still ought to have like a level of evaluation of these specific burdens. I just want to make one thing clear. It is very possible in a round where you're having a regret motion or you're having a policy motion, but still, as a judge, you evaluate both cases from open position, and even if the team does not have the burden of a model, burden of a counterfactual, you still closely think that government still takes the debate. And this is why evaluating these burdens this way allows you to be like less biased, but also allows you to be much more holistic your engagements and evaluation of the engagement in the debate. So I'm gonna talk about like what to pay keen interest to. So even when these burdens exist, the moment a burden is raised by one team over the other, that burden cannot be left like a POI. Like when you're trying to interrogate like why government team is not fulfilling the burden of a counterfactual, it becomes an active element in the debate. It's like it's now something to have intention on. So it's no longer a burden of just government improving. It's also a burden to you because the other team has like it's also a burden to the other team that has implied it in the debate to be seen as something as important by the judge. Why what I want you to sort of like see very closely is I don't want you to give a call and say government bench loses the debate because opposition did not offer a counterfactual or a model. If they are offering, if that's what the kind of engagement that opposition is raising, their case also needs to sort of like carry the burden of engaging like some kind of a very, very clear counterfactual implication of why they wanted this kind of counterfactual to be very important in the debate. So what I'm trying to prove here is that you cannot raise a burden on the other team, or as a judge, you ought not to call it as an automatic win situation just because one team raises a burden on the other, and their case is exclusive of any implication of what that burden by proposition could most likely look like. So there are two things that you should expect while having this debate. So the first is that when a team raises the burden that is unfolded on proposition, they will most likely try to hold that burden on their side. And this gives them higher engagement, but it also most likely now becomes much more persuasive on their side. And you ought to recognize that as a judge. So opposition says these guys don't have a counterfactual from government side. Let us tell you what the most likely counterfactual in debate is. That is how you holistically ought to see that this team is trying to engage that burden. Else, if it's just an isolated thing and they just say these guys don't prove the counterfactual and just go ahead to run their arguments, they are not doing the engagement on the burden. As such, you should not hold that as a priority of engagement in the debate because it's never taken to a larger extent of engagement. It's just it's just a soft claim, if I might say so, and it doesn't lead to any kind of engagement. So as per that point, you cannot prioritize it over other forms of clashes, even the soft clashes that I've earlier spoken about, because it does not have enough extent to which it goes to influence that debate, even on the opposition stance. So I think I've explained like what opposition most likely supposed to do in order for them to have a higher extent of engagement on that burden and for you to evaluate them and reward them for kind of trying to fix the mess of proposition. The second way that most likely this debate could happen is that speakers might not most likely try to build a counterfactual, but they might try to imply to you what the strategic implication of missing a counterfactual is, and you ought to like sort of like reward these two in terms of like one, the strategy they have played by telling you why a missing element of a burden, especially from the motion type, could be much more important for them. But secondly, in terms of like the kind of content that they are able to build off this engagement on the burden. So I'm gonna try to illustrate it as well. So a team tells you, Mr. Chair or Madam Speaker, we don't have a counterfactual in the debate from proposition, and this is why it's bad. It's bad because opposition now cannot most likely know to what extent the impacts from government are exclusive without them proving that the ideals that they are preaching would happen within their counterfactual. As such, our case becomes much more persuasive because we are going to explain like why our case is much more exclusive. So a team has not just like the team has not just stopped at the point of just telling you these guys are missing a counterfactual. They have directly explained what the strategic implication missing that burden is on the opposition team, but also what it's going to allow them do on that. Like, sorry, it's going to imply in terms of like the proposition team, but also what it allows them to do on the opposition team. You ought to reward this and accept this kind of like engagement because it's very logical for them to try and as such, but also as I said earlier, they have not just plugged the burden, they are utilizing the burden to fulfill strategy, but also to actively build content over it. So to some extent, you must hold this as a higher level of like contention in the debate. Again, what I was trying to evaluate with like the burdens that static burdens that come out of motion types and the like was to say like as a judge, when do I hold the flagging these burdens as important to my assessment of the debate? And when do I reward teams for engaging them? And I think I've been able to summarize like to what extent teams have to go in order for you to validate these things and in order for you to hold these things as some of the primary things that you ought to discuss in your deliberation, but still while offering OA because they have become like much more contentious in the debate. So that's what you need to know and how you get to identify in way of like this hard first layer of clashing. So let's go to the second type of burdens. So the second type of burdens are very, very subtle because they are not burdens that come out of like specific motion types, but they can come out of like a variety of things. One is the nature of the case that the other team is offering. Two, I'm gonna explain that. Two, the nature of arguments that the other team is also running in that debate. Three, a team in of itself claiming what they ought to prove and what they ought not to prove that is out of like the manual. But fourthly and lastly, the nature of words that are in the motion itself, but do not imply to a specific motion type. So there are certain types of motions that we have grown to call special motion types. These are motions with either married motion types or like motions that directly come out of utilization of specific words that would otherwise be notes that carrying the same ideal burdens that needs to be in a debate where the word doesn't exist. But let's start with the first kind of um burdens and how you get to understand and sort of like see these things. So there are three ways in which like teams most likely get to present their cases. The first is by having a case that is based on appreciating a certain level of change, right? So teams might not most likely say that we believe that there is a problem on opposition, or we believe that there's a specific a keen figure of interest on opposition. They might just want to translate society from one point A to another point B. It means that teams are also going to have to prove different burdens as compared to all the other types that we are going to discuss. So, what you ought to understand and what you ought to sort of like try to identify is the nature of case in of itself. Is it a case about change? Is it a case about the problem and solution and how they meet this? Or is it a case that is within the interest of specific figures within the debate? This could be stakeholders. I'll earlier discuss around like stakeholder framing, but it could also be around like specific agents of change. Now, why speakers have likely turned their cases into this is because sometimes they like running arguments that value and respect specific positions or interest. So, in terms of change, in terms of like problems and solving them, but also lastly, in terms of like specific figures of interest. So, they have kind of learned the notion that I can run this argument in an actor debate, but I can also try to imply that the debate ought to be specifically about this figure of interest, whether it's the interest of like an agent of change that is going to cause that change, or like the interest of a specific stakeholder that is going to be affected by the motion. They can do this and they can try to justify it, why as to why like that ultimately should be the discussion we are having. So again, in terms of identifying this, you have to categorize the cases and how they are presented into these three like classes. But secondly, now you need to understand like what the teams are most likely supposed to prove and what they are not supposed to prove. So in terms of change, the first thing that they have to offer is why the change in itself is meaningful. So you value a team and you get to sort of like reward them if they are able to prove to you that their case about change guarantees meaningful change in any way that they can sort of like be able to weigh it up as to why this change is meaningful. So of course there are myriad of ways of doing this as we'll discuss, like there's scale of impact, there's like giving you a retrospect and showing you why the future ultimately ought to be better, and very many ways that they can probably explain why this change should be a point of transcendence for society. So that's just what you need to understand in terms of them proving that this change is very significant for us. Before you even go into evaluating their argument, you ought to sort of like try and evaluate whether the stance that they are making about what kind of case they are presenting is actually much more reasonable and persuasive. So, to the extent that they don't do this, you understand now that one, they have less strategic like kind of rewards that come in that debate. So their speaker scores will probably be low, or they'll have like some kind of low margin win and something like that. Like it's around whether you believe that the kind of case they presented is ultimately true, but also it's supposed that this perspective is supposed to help you what to exactly say as what the teams miss out. So when you're giving general feedback, but also when you're trying to justify like why you believe that debate was average in the like, these are the things that should run in mind that evolve cases. When you're talking about like problem solution cases, there's also a couple of things that also be considered. So one, if the teams explain the problem, they have to do a lot of problem analysis to prove either like why the problem is exclusive, why it's a root cause for all the other problems, or the extent of harm that it has is probably much more meaningful than all the other problems that they could do. And they also ought to offer that solution. They ought to explain why the solution is relevant and why the solution solves the problem. So that's the burden that they are actively pushing onto themselves. Again, you just utilize these things to ask yourself on whether the team did much more better in terms of their strategy in the debate, but also things you could offer them in like general feedback. So when a team doesn't directly feel all these things, it means their case is ultimately less persuasive, but it also means that you can constantly question based off what type of case the other team, the competing team, is offering in the debate. You can have a up on whether you prefer the case that has been to some extent like sort of defended in burdens as opposed to a case that has a less extent of within the same burden. So you have a team in opposition offering problem solution, you have a team in opposition that is telling you about what's literally going to change. And you just need to understand the dynamics in which like you get to prioritize one case over the other, and then maybe you can then have an engagement the arguments themselves, but you just want to know like which case you ought to prioritize. That's the criterion you ought to follow, and that is how you explain to like the speakers the framework that you use to prioritize one case over the other, essentially. So that's just it. And yeah, lastly, so the last type or nature of case that teams usually present is a case that is based on like a keen interest into specific figures in the debate. So figures in the debate could be again as stakeholders. I'll talk much more because it's a branch of framing in its own, but they are also what we agents of change. Most of the times teams can agree that change ought to happen, but their contention is supposed to cause that change. So you will have a debate that is about things like this house believes that parents ought to be responsible for their ought to be held accountable for their children's crimes or atrocities or something like that, right? And they are going to explain to you on one side like how this is going to change parents in terms of how they act. That's proposition, and opposition will agree that whatever children are doing is wrong, but also we need to have a shift in terms of held accountable, and they think that that is probably government and not the parents in of themselves. While you are evaluating this kind of case, you need to identify which team is able to prove to you the duty of one agent of change over the other and why it's much more stronger. Two, you need to identify the justification that is given for the kind of change that each stakeholder is going to offer. That is to say, parents can offer like some kind of behavior training for children, but state can also offer some kind of behavior training for children. The difference here will be in how it's offered. So maybe they need to explain how exclusive that is for you to have like a way up on why like the other form gaining change through this agent of change is much more meaningful and is much more important. And if you're able to identify these in terms of their exclusiveness, you can now start rewarding like those cases for being much more strategic in the round. The other thing that it influences is to expect whether the impacts are largely exclusive or like they are asymmetric, like within that regard. Whether they are symmetric within that regard. So if the extent to which one team stopped is by just explaining like why government is so good to children and the like, and the other team probably explains like we think parents are good because they are behavioral training means that they are going to teach children how to react to strangers. They are going to teach children how to sort of like um engage within society. They are going to condition them in terms of respecting specific values and turning to specific actions as means of response, but also engagement within society. Sometimes you ought to sort of like ask yourself on how this is going to be persuasive in itself. If if on the comparative, it's not proven that this is only parents that can do this. So it is a logically true argument, but you might want to evaluate whether the other stance taken by a team, the other stakeholder taken by a team, does not do it better. That's not the point for you to prove as a judge, but whether the other team ought to have proven why theirs is much more sufficient and unique. So again, this helps you to try and categorize like which clashes are going to come prior. So for example, if you find that the other team has not proven why their agent of change and how they cause that change is much more meaningful, is much more important, like I think to me that would be like in the third tier, like a lower tier for me to have the points of contention and the impacts that largely come out of that. Because I don't see the other team strong persuading me on why the mechanism of achieving that change is going to be much more different and as such much more important. So again, classifying the priority of the clashes. So that's what most likely it's going to help you to do. So that's just it with the nature of cases. I think now we should move on to the nature of argumentations. So why I say nature of argumentation is because speakers now, especially those that don't want to do like the broader world framing or the broader debate framing, go with argument specific framing. So their arguments carry specific framing that directly tells you or implicitly tells you the kind of burden that they want to prove and the kind of burden that they want the other teams to engage them on. If you have been in a debate and you're judging, there are times when you say, but opposition refuted the argument from proposition. However, they had short ended engagement on that argument. They just holistically defended it as an action of protectionism. So let's say government was running an argument of protectionism and why this debate ought to value protectionism, and they explain like what it means for them, the impacts that come out of it. But you just feel like this argument shaped a specific burden in terms of how it ought to be responded. So the way this happens is that we can both run an argument on protectionism, but maybe I frame it so differently that the way it ought to be responded to is not just by responding that protectionism is bad. I'm gonna give an example. So the motion is this house supports African countries to nationalize their economy. And the way that the other the proposition team presents their argument is African countries have largely not had control over their resources. In the retrospect, because they didn't have enough knowledge on how to utilize these things to compete in global markets, because they were largely colonized and as such, those resources were sort of like commanded over by the colonialists, but also currently because they are still neo-colonialist tendencies that don't allow them to exercise as much control, and lastly because of like the nature of competition in the markets that literally outcompetes them at every level to maximize how they utilize their resources. And because of this, our case is going to be that nationalization is a tool of decolonization, and it's what we are going to prove. So this team is explaining an argument that is about nationalization, but in that they are trying to prove how nationalization is going to decolonize the African continent. So when opposition responds to them by presenting like how nationalization is bad in terms of economic terms, that is to say, um, nationalization is bad because like it's our governments are largely very very bad in terms of having things like bureaucratic processes. They are slow, they don't respect innovation and the like. That argument in of itself has not been holistically responded to. Notice the element of what they are trying to prove is not that nationalization is the best policy to have the best economies. The burden that government has imposed on itself is that it wants to prove that nationalization actually decolonizes the economy. So as you're trying to weigh up in like what team actually does the ideal engagement to respond to the engagement that is being given on the other side, you might want to try to identify the uniqueness in the kind of argument specific framing that they offer for themselves in terms of what they want their arguments to prove and maybe what they don't want their arguments to prove. So I think you can directly see from the example that that argument in of itself has not been naturally and like maximally responded to by opposition team just by claiming why nationalization is bad, even though they give like four reasons. The engagement is there, but it's a short-handed engagement. So again, this helps you to classify those clashes. So I think this becomes a priority one clash, and who gets to sort of like what burden that they set for themselves. So again, that just helps you with the engagement, and it helps you with like trying to evaluate how like holistically the engagement is being done. So that's just it with the nature of arguments. I'll take any questions if any. Okay, so let me just take this question from Jesse. In case the two teams have two different contexts, answer them. What do I base on to give verdict? So let's say you have reached a point in your judgment, and the context that both teams offer is equally supported. So what you're going to ask yourself is like the extent to which this is useful to their arguments, and the extent to which probably this has been defended. But I think the second criterion is already what you're trying to imply, that each one strongly supports their context. So for you to see what team you prioritize, you're going to now look for which team strategically utilizes their context for their case and for their kind of arguments. So you have speakers that will tell you, and this is like they give you an argument. Our argument is A, it proves B, and this is why it's important in the debate, because the context we give you implies that these impacts become much more important for these people. So these people, this team is not just running the argument, it's also telling you like why the argument is important for the context they earlier painted, or it's telling you like what duty it plays in the overall strategy that they've had. So I think that is the second criterion that you could probably use to evaluate like makes much more persuasiveness out of that. Again, like debate is about a judge being persuaded by one team over the other. And to me, naturally, it's out of you seeing like which team goes the extra mile to persuade you. So that would honestly be around the strategy that you utilize for every single thing that they give you. There's this tendency of having things like matter dumping in debates where like teams want to shove you with as enough matter as possible. So the way you honestly get out of that trap is by asking yourself which team made much more meaningfulness of the material that they gave me for me to see how persuasive they are. So that's just something that you already need to consider. Okay, so I think that's it. What is the best way that a team can justify framing of burden they have chosen? I don't know what the best way to justify the framing they have offered is, but yeah, that would be a session for like how to probably justify how to do framing in this session is like how to be like the neutral judge that gets to identify and weigh things. So I kind of don't want to dwell into that. I only want to dwell into like how you identify the framing and is to evaluate whether that framing is superior to an. But there are obviously different ways in which you get to justify your framing by just coming up with logical reasons as to why or structural reasons as to why your framing should be true. Okay, so I'm gonna go to the we've talked about the nature of cases, nature of arguments. Going to talk about the nature of wording and how it largely influences the balance that the teams ought to have. So there are special motions that carry special wording. If you've seen a motion with things like glamorization, glorification, the rise, decline, award, all these motions are largely special, and the engagement that's to be made from the arguments in the debate can also be special or is supposed to be special. So you want to understand as a judge, or you should always have this question as to why CAP set the motion to be this way. Again, I want to put a disclaimer. There is no such thing as an automatic loss, but these things largely influence how you express yourself as a judge. So after you giving oral adjudication, you want to be able to tell the teams like this is what you guys probably could have made in the debate to make it better, like to both teams, not giving it as reasons as to why one team loses over the other. And in order for you to know these things, like you need to ideally be able to identify like the motion in itself, but also what special words imply on that motion. But also because teams tend to make engagement and contentions based off the wordings. So, for example, this house supports the rise of secularism. That motion ought to be engaged differently as this house supports secularism. And a team can be able to front. And I like this because it's usually opposition teams that do this, and you want to really understand like what specifically this is going to lead to in terms of the debate, and be able to identify the whether this contention is a hard-on contention or it's like a very soft-ended contention. So proposition argues that secularism has guaranteed much more harmony within society. It has allowed people to explore their choices worldwide, getting to learn of one religion and getting to learn of other religion from society itself, but also literally having that to any religious institution and get to know like what their religious practices, traditions are and learn from them, even without like being wholly identified as a member of their as an exclusive member of their religion. And on the other side, opposition raises a tension. They say that, sure, this debate is not about secularism. This debate is about the rise of secularism. So again, just like we dealt with all the other forms of burdens and how strongly you get to prioritize the contention, this is how you ought to last like evaluate it as well. So are the arguments that opposition present on their side within the respect of the rise? Because opposition cannot say that debate is about the rise, but they also argue just why secularism is bad. If they do that, then you're going to evaluate both teams based on the nature of value that they have offered in the debate. What value is stronger than the other? However, if opposition continues to strategize around the rise with the nature of the arguments they give, then it definitely means that opposition is much more persuasive in the debate, and you can utilize this same framework in terms of determining the call, but also in terms of like defending your decision as a means of justification to why the proposition arguments do not come prior to the opposition arguments, especially with this special type of motion. Secondly, again, if opposition, even with even without like directly concluding what their arguments mean on the rise, but just telling you why the rise would have been much more important to engage on, that means that you also ought to prioritize like the kind of engagement that you create on the rise. So most of the times, teams like to characterize what the rise most likely looks like. And they will have that engagement based off the characterization of the rise of X and not X itself. You have to be very able to identify this. Even when teams fail to do so, you have to be able to sort of like comment on that after you've given your oral adjudication and you're trying to give teams like feedback and all those things. So that is how you get to strongly evaluate but also identify whether this is a hard clash or a soft on clash that you ought not to prioritize. Lastly, then, so they are burdens that do not come out of any of the three things that we have discussed. Burdens that come out of the nature of argumentation, burdens that come out of the nature of special motion wording, burdens that don't come out of um, the idea of context being given and the likes. These burdens just come out of teams openly claiming that this is the burden that the other side ought to prove, and this is we are also openly going to defend. So the reason why teams usually do this is because they have been given like a rather abstract notion and they just want to have like a very good debate. And for them to establish that, they need to come to a consensus to what burdens like everyone ought to prove. So let's say you have a motion and the motion is this house would um delegalize capital, sorry, delegalize let me look for something. Delegalize drugs, right? So maybe the teams do not want to offer like context in the debate, but they just want to narrow the debate on what the most contentious things in the debate and your judgment should lie within for them to be given like interest, but also to be given like that kind of backing for the debate. So theirs is to say, proposition is to say that for us to have a very engaging debate, we are not going to base our action, like we are not going to base our defenses from evidence of pre-existing nations or conditions that support like the element that we want to delegalize. And this is why. One, because those elements can exist in isolated instances that lead to other factors of discussion that might be very secondary to the discussion that we want to have right now. This is a very neutral debate that we should. Two, because if we are to discuss that this debate happens in a specific country or happens within a specific context, it most likely minimizes the engagement of maybe the moral formats that we ought to discuss that are supposed to be much more holistic and much more global and much more encompassing. That is, they are categorical imperative. They can't be around specific countries. They have to be the universal guideline of this. So I think by a team doing that or trying to do that, like they want to have their cases based out of like the natural nature of things, and they want to have the debate as abstract as it is presented. Motions like this house would kill Hitler. So the teams just want you to have like a very abstract engagement that does not lead to extrapolation of the debate, so that like it's now going to have like as many crazy arguments as possible. But what you need to identify here again is that teams are able to why they are the burden they are trying to push into the debate, why the perspective they are trying to have in the debate is defended in terms of like why it makes the debate better, but they also need to defend like why it becomes slightly comparative and why the other team still has like a chance of engagement. So all you need to identify that one, this is not a form of straw manning. Two, this is not squirreling the debate so that there is no form of like engagement that could happen. And three, that teams are able to defend that this is the framework in which we should actually engage. These are patterns that exist on both sides. We justify them, we show you how they are comparative each side. And yeah, then you can get to have this contention in the debate as one of the things that you should prior and have within the consideration of the relevance of the argumentation and content that is going to be presented by all teams. So definitely that's what I think would resolve that layer of the nature of pattern framing and how it happens in debate. I'm gonna try to check whether there are any questions about pattern framing and how to evaluate them. Okay, how do you evaluate motions that can have conflicting framings with marginal difference? E.g., this house believes that money can buy happiness. There is a chance opposition can claim money is just a tool to happiness, but can't buy it. Again, so the burden that then comes out of this, that's the claim that opposition wants to run. Opposition has to sort of like one, what comparative exists on the other side. So, yeah, sure, you're going to try to prove to us that money is a tool, but you also need to prove to us like why money in of itself can definitely not buy happiness. So it's, I think the burden here is to try and the two things rather than just proving that money is a tool to happiness. So that's a burden that they push onto themselves, so that way you get to sort of like evaluate whether their argument is very strongly presented, and how persuasive you should consider it is based off that comparative, because by the nature of their claim, it's a claim that wants to prove like two comparative things. So I think that's how I would get to evaluate such an argument for that specific motion. I hope that was able to make some level of sense. Okay, lastly, I'm going to go and talk about like more remarks, because these are also things that usually present very hard tensions in the debate that you probably wanna reconcile first before getting to individually introspect the cases, the arguments, the like presented by different teams. So there are a couple of moral remarks, and teams like to sort of like tell you, so Chair, for opposition to win this debate, we are going to prove to you that our side gives the best utilitarian benefits. And then proposition might most likely run something like, our case is important because our case proves why people have a duty to care beyond any other practical impact in the debate that ought to be run. So we always see this level of framing when teams want us to buy a certain perspective over the other. Why it's important is because given of the framing that you're going to buy into, it's going to influence how you consider the arguments that fall within that framing relevant. How do we identify these, and how do we get to evaluate them holistically as elements that are being shared in the debate? The first is on, I'm going to do this simple one because we have really repeated it over and over again. The extent to which teams strategically utilize the moral framework that they have given you. And then I'm going to go like into the other ways to identify it, but also evaluate it. So again, as I said, debate is about like engaging, but also being persuasive by sharing something. So a team doesn't get to say, like giving a very beautiful opening statement that we think humans to have a duty of care to each other before they do to other form of primal species. They ought not to give you that framing and just run away and not like any sort of like logical implication or conclusion of their arguments on the same. So if you wanna use this as, if you wanna consider this as a very important framing that proposition offered, you wanna explore the extent to which proposition was able to strategically use this element in the debate, not just to claim it, but to sort of like get to engage their arguments around that, get to engage the other team's arguments around that, offer way ups on the very same. So that is how you get to say that, oh, maybe I should consider this as something to give in oral adjudication, because it has a full extent of engagement that not I create to fit for my decision, but other the teams themselves are able to on engagement. to sort of like persuade me within that regard. Otherwise, you're going to sound very unfair for utilizing that one opening statement that these guys had as a reason to why like they get to win the debate and the other team doesn't. So you just wanna not do that. You would rather not prioritize that as a clash and have it like maybe something that you thought was to some extent very interesting to share in the debate. Like, yeah, I just want to say like the opposition had a opening statement. I would like to see this, but I think in terms of general feedback, you guys should like probably create a bigger engagement around this because it provided like some level of framing for me or like kind of vision for me on how I get to see your arguments and what where they are coming from and what ultimately they are trying to prove. So like that's how you're going to do it. You're not going to do it if they didn't have a full-on extent of engagement onto the other elements that are in the debates. And yeah, so let's go to the other things to identify about like more and literally how you get to evaluate them. So from moral frameworks, like for me, are like a field of view on what we should probably get to care about in terms of actions of people, but also like the morality behind it. That's a goodness or like some form of badness out of it. So what teams have to do to you is that the conventional kind of like moral framework for debates is always utilitarianism. To be specific, it's consequentialist utilitarianism. Like in any form of like engagement, people care about like what the direct consequence of things is going to be, right? However, teams are at liberty to imply different moral frameworks for them to have the debate based on how they justify that to be the case. So one, a team can probably want a shift from the consequentialist kind of debate to one that is about maybe things like deontology or virtue ethics, but they have to justify like why that is going to give again better engagement in the debate. So they have to defend the comparatives that exist on either side. They have to disestablish why the other moral framework ought not to be used in the first place. But lastly, they also have to create engagement. Again, they have to create engagement of that moral framework and prove that it doesn't squirrel the debate to the extent that it sort of like decreases the value that comes out of that specific debate. So I think largely those are the points of interest to try and justify. Now, so the last point of interest, I want you to go back and remember like about principled arguments. Moral frameworks are suggestions by teams for a field of view, but that in its own very nature is akin to trying to respect a fundamental kind of nature of view. So it's like most likely like a principle of sorts. So the thing that teams have in terms of like for you to identify what they do, but also how you get to evaluate it as something that should be conscious and around is one, explain what the moral framework is. Two, explain why the moral framework is important in the debate. I think that pretty much covers the last criterions I've given you, like a minute ago. But also, lastly, explain the implication of the moral framework in on like the argumentation and how it ought to be made. So since it's framing still, you still need to explain like what the implication of that framing is most likely going to be. Like, are we supposed to respect arguments that are we supposed to respect arguments that are about the duty of care for something else on the other side, since it's deontology? Are we supposed to hold like virtues that the analysis based off like whether this is a virtue or a vice or like virtue ethics, or are we most likely supposed to be persuaded much more about like the consequences of an action in itself? So they have to come up with a logical implication of that frame that they have given you in terms of how it informs how you yourself as a judge ought to um probably prioritize arguments, prioritize cases. So that's just it. I think those are the things that they most likely ought to do. Start now saying that this was a really, really big contentious point of the debate, and it largely influenced my decision. So that's just it with moral frameworks, and how teams most of the time want to utilize them as means of framing. So, any questions about framing that is an outcome of engaging moral frameworks? Okay, so I'll suppose there's no other question. So we are now largely done with like the elements that usually gets to influence hard clashes. And this has sort of like allowed us to understand one, how to determine clashes, and how we get to identify and weigh those issues related to specific elements that are shared within debates. That largely covers our topic one. So I'm gonna go into topic two, and that's like comparing arguments. Under this, the points of interest are the size of the impact, the logical consistency, and evidence strength. Okay, so I'm gonna tell you guys like why there's a very big dilemma, especially for judges around these things, and why debates has largely shifted into us having to pay very keen attention to like comparing arguments. This is simple. It's because teams now have like a lot of access to matter, simply want to matter dump a lot to a level where like you as a judge can be to some extent overwhelmed with the amount of information that comes from either team, but there is no point of weighing that is offered. So this part of the session is important for you as an average intelligent voter with own intellect and neutral perspective. Use your intellect to guide whether the arguments on the other side can have like some kind of logical connection that allows you to weigh. So that's why this session is like why this topic, sorry, is largely important, because it's a very clear difference in terms of like the strategy that teams want to play. But it's not just that, it's because teams pay very keen interest to those two levels, the level of claiming and the level of like analysis that is offered anyways. So the extent to which they are most engaged the debate on is by giving as many claims as possible, or by giving as many layers of analysis possible, but still without a comparative. So I tell people, I train like two things when you're prepping. Ask yourself if the mechanism you're offering your side that is going to lead to impact A can exist on the other side. If it doesn't, you have an exclusive analyzed mechanism that leads to impact A. But secondly, you can also ask yourself on whether impact A can exist on the other side, or it cannot exist on the other side, exclusive of the nature of mechanism that they are probably trying to construct. So why this is important is because most of the times when you're able to see the comparative that lies on both sides as a judge, it allows you to dismiss certain things as not very important or prior. So you're in a debate, and the kids are trying to prove to you like why this specific social movement is going to have much more buy-in, right? And that's the extent to which they analyze the argument. But you think that the other team talking about like things like how the integrity or the commitment within the social movement is going to be compromise is also an equally important argument that you want to have. So what you need to do now is like ask yourself on what the most likely comparative on either side is, right? So if the other team explain like some kind of mechanism that leads to that, you can try to invoke your intellect to see whether that same mechanism works for the other side. And this is just to break that deadlock because most of the times when you end up in like mid rooms or really low rooms, you are in a deadlock of matter or analysis, and you simply don't know how you're going to prioritize like one thing or the other. I think you can see like why it becomes important to sort of like confer your knowledge towards like the most likely part that exists on the other side. So that's just it. But I'm going to go into the very, very clear um things to determine like the comparative of the comparative of arguments as within like the topic guide itself. So let's start with the size of impact. So the size of impact is definitely how it definitely determines like how persuasive someone's impact is in a debate, especially when they tend to offer it like implicitly. So there are times when you need to look at how many stakeholders, like the other team's case is probably affecting, favoring, or how it most likely leads to a much greater means of livelihood based off like the statistics they are able to offer, or like how most likely they are going to do that, or the manner in which they present those arguments. So a team can tell you that our case is not just about women. Our case, even for feminism, is about how women engage with children, how they engage with men. This is the stance we take in that debate. I think just by them doing that, and then their arguments being around like how feminism that is embracing the duty of care is probably going to change how women react to children, how they engage with children, and how they engage with men. There's an implicit, like, kind of direction to show you they have much more stakeholders that they are trying to engage than what the other team could present. If at all, the other team is just talking about like why this is very harmful to women. So the benefits that affirmative offers encompass a larger scale, like size of impact, while the harm that is preached by the opposition encompasses like a smaller size of impact. That could also largely influence like the meaningfulness of their case and how you get to prioritize one case over the other. The tricky bit with size of impact is that it's a double scale. So you can see it as a horizontal scale of how big things are, but you can always also see it as a vertical scale that determines how deep things are. So it is very okay to sort of like identify whether like opposition goes an extra mile to explain why there's a level of depth that women are much more affected to the extent that you as a judge might not even want to care about all these other groups. But again, as you're defending your call that way, you must be able to like weigh up why that size of depth is much more reasonable to you than the size of like numbers that is being offered by the other side. So I think that is a clear way to identify the comparative on scale, but also how to defend it, like while you're giving oral adjudication. So it can't be a one-sided defense. Again, you have to be comparative as the same policy you're preaching to the other teams and trying to enforce around their arguments. So that's it to do with like size. So let's go to logical consistency. These are honestly like all these elements are deadlock breakers. Logical consistency deals with two things majorly. There's a times when you look at the manner in which the argument is offered, offering, and they kind of contradict the very logic that they are trying to preach in the debate. So they say that there is a problem in the debate. However, the impacts that they produce can be logically deduced to sort of like non-solve the problem or even worsen that. So this might not be something that is flagged in the round, but you just feel like you are at this point of a deadlock of engaging both teams. And now it all falls down to how they utilize their manner of speech and their logical consistency. So yours is to defend your call by saying, I had to closely vote opposition over prop because they lacked much more logical consistency. And this like largely um determined how much persuasiveness like I could get from their case. So since it was logically inconsistent and you prove that this is what impact they give, this is how it's contradictory to the kind of argumentation that they are trying debate or the kind of stance that they are trying to offer in the debate. So, in as much as both the cases were analytically true, I just felt like this logical inconsistency made the opposition case much more persuasive to me because of like how it is much more logically consistent than what is being given by like pro. So that's the first criterion of logical consistency. It's only around how teams strategize to achieve certain things, and the matter they give is actually very contradictory to what happens there. The other thing is like to do with the individual speakers that are within a team. So logical consistencies come most of the times because of like lack of strategy or unclear planning by the speakers or even like not very much interest within deliberate prepping, right? So speaker one says that you need to perceive the emotion this way. Speaker two comes and changes that perspective. Speaker three goes back to the and that's where they want to weigh the debate. So the conventional acceptance by the manual is that you're supposed to go with what speaker one said first, but you can explain like why that largely affected their team dynamics and it also affects like how convincing they are. So you can now say that the level of persuasion you had from their case with that logical inconsistency or like the inconsistency of the speakers made you prioritize like, the other team over theirs. So I think like that's most likely it's how to identify it, evaluate it, but also how you get to defend it. But in this, the other thing to consider again, like no double standards here. There must be a very huge extent to which those logical consistencies become like very important to you to consider, to have them as something that is worth mentioning to determine that call. The first metric I've given around this is like that maybe you're having a deadlock and you can no longer evaluate them. And you must explain why you're having a deadlock. The two teams, then you come on a conclusion of determining like who had much more logical consistency. But secondly, is if the logical consistency in of itself is like something that had a very big impact on the arguments that were offered, most especially their positive matter. So if a team, there is a team which can make a logical inconsistency that you can most likely brush off, ignore, because it's it's there, but the speaker doesn't dwell on it that much, so that it becomes like now you're competing on whether to go with side A that is logically inconsistent with the matter that they have already given you. Like there, it can be to a smaller extent not worth sharing, prioritizing within your OA as a very important thing to consider as to why you're making that decision, but rather something that you give in general feedback. However, if it is so greatly like extended as a logical consistency, I honestly feel to buy A, you have to leave B, which was earlier mentioned, and like the mechanisms out of the logical inconsistency presented are like too strong in like they are too validated, they are given much more time in the like it means now you can at least prioritize that as a point of interest for you to offer within oral adjudication and also to make your call around, because maybe that largely influenced how like the other team also had to spend a lot of time responding to something that isn't worth it, how it spoiled engagement in the debate, but also how it spoils the overall performance of the team that the logical inconsistency comes from. So you had to deprioritize them anyways. So I think that's the last thing that you should badly consider when it comes to logical inconsistency and inconsistency. So that's it. So we are going to go through the very last thing, quick guide, and that's evidence strength. Oh yeah, and there's a reason like why there's evidence strength and not just evidence. If you have been judging, or when you are going to judge, you will find most of the times preaching things like case scenarios, they will present examples, they will present theories, they will present a lot of evidence to back the ideals that they are trying to preach in the debate. However, for you to get to sort of like evaluate these things, you have to rely on the metric of evidence strength. And there are largely three things that get to like how strong evidence is. So the first thing that teams ultimately need to do is define that the factors that are within the case scenario are the same factors that are within the debate. So they need to characterize that. Why is that important? It's important because it allows you now to not go into the logical fallacy of like correlation and causation. So just because things correlate, it might not be true that they will cause the same effect. But the only way you get to betray like that logical fallacy is if you go ahead and say that the factors that influence this are the same factors that are influencing the same element X. So most likely it's going to be. So teams cannot claim this policy worked in the US, so it should work in Ghana. No, like you now have to explain that the economy of Ghana is much more likely like the economy of the US, or the factors that influence the economy of Ghana are most likely the same factors that influence the economy of the US. And as such, our evidence becomes like much more stronger because it means you're most likely going to implement the same mechanisms, you're most likely going to implement the same policies. You can even almost like share the same average cost implementing this. Like now I can understand why most likely that evidence in of itself is not an isolated incident, but it's something that correlates and allows for me to understand why the factors are the same in the debate. So you might most likely have the same effect. So that's how one you can evaluate like the strength of that evidence. Two, evidence is considered strong if like there's a nature of relationship that is developed around the evidence onto the nature of like the debate that you're having, or the elements in of itself that a team wants to prove in the debate. Now this is different from explaining the factor, because there are different kinds of like ways to explain the relationship that exists, right? I'm gonna give an example. So someone might want to bring the case scenario of the Russia-Ukraine war, and maybe a case scenario of a debate that is about the militia in West Africa. So all they can try to do is create a relationship between like how the social contract operates in Russia and how the social contract operates in these militia countries. So by defining that and being able to defend like why the dynamics of those things are not the same depending on what they are trying to, or are the same, they can be able to sort of like defend that the evidence in of itself will be very strong in that debate. So it's not just presenting again some kind of like isolated incidents, but it's directly generating a relationship between the evidence that is presented and what the debate is ultimately about. So that is how you're able to determine like why the evidence is strong, and how you get to like assess the strategic implication of that evidence. The last criterion then is the same criterion that we have said all the other elements that usually people are into debate that are up for evaluation. And that element is the extent to which the team utilizes the evidence. That's what probably makes it like very strong. So you cannot provide your OA saying that the US example that a team presented was very strong, yet they don't largely strategize around it to produce their arguments, to defend their arguments on the same very case and the likes. So they have to weaponize that evidence again by doing the first two things or one of the first two things I've talked about, but they also have to encompass that evidence in their case. So by explaining the implication of the evidence and how it's probably influencing their arguments, how their arguments ought to be responded to, how the other team probably ought to sort of like defend their case now in the light. Like there must be some level of strategy created around that piece of evidence for it to become very strong so that it demands some level of contention for you to weigh, but also so that like it can be encompassed in your oral adjudication. So largely that's it to do with evidence strength. And yeah, I think that's all that we had for today. I'm gonna ask if there are any sort of like questions, but you can also feel free to drop them in the chat. You can unmute. You can always reach out to me, WhatsApp, and on the Discord server. Otherwise, that's the session we had today. I wanna give like 1 minute to see if there are any questions. If not, I'll give back the flow to OC. Okay, so I suppose there are no open questions. Thank you for listening in, and thanks for DIA for making this one arrangement. I wish you all the best, and may the Almighty keep us well. OC, you may take over.
Thank you, Rahim, for the session.